Kia ora tātou. Hey, thanks everybody for coming. This is a great event, a great turnout. It's a real pleasure to be here. I got here a little late this morning, which was cause for some consternation, I think, but pleased to say I'm here and ready to go. So, I think I've got about 10 minutes. I will attempt to keep the time. And if I press the big green button, there we go. So I'm going to go through some of the science around the changing climate, keep it fairly global at first, and then look at what the implications are for Kapiti. So starting off just with the basics of the science, the sun provides pretty much all of the energy that we see in the climate system. So the sun shines, and therefore we have the weather and the climate. But the thing about the sun, about sunlight, is that the atmosphere is essentially it's transparent to sunlight. The sun shines through the air. It doesn't warm the air directly. It warms the Earth's surface. The sunlight that's not reflected away by clouds or whatever is absorbed at the Earth's surface. So the Earth warms up, and it's actually the Earth that warms the atmosphere. So the Earth radiates energy just like the sun does, but because the Earth's a lot cooler, the energy is much less intense. And there are gases in the air that are very good at absorbing this kind of energy, not sunlight, but what we call infrared energy or heat, what our bodies radiate. So having these gases in the air, like carbon dioxide and so on, mean that the atmosphere warms up because it intercepts this heat the Earth radiates. So the atmosphere radiates heat as well. And so some of that heat is sent back down to the Earth's surface. So the Earth is warmed both by the sun, but also by the atmosphere because we have these gases in the air. It's very like the situation with a blanket on your bed. Your body radiates heat, the blanket intercepts some of that heat and holds it underneath to keep you warmer than you would be without the blanket. This blanket of greenhouse gas keeps what's underneath that, the Earth's surface, warmer than it would be otherwise. So if the climate's changing, one of these two things has to be changing. Either the sun's getting brighter if it's warming up, or there's more greenhouse gas, the blanket's getting thicker. Or if it's getting colder, then either the sun's getting dimmer or there's less greenhouse gas in the air. That's how ice ages work. It's how all the climate changes we know over millions of years have operated. So we know that this amount of sunlight coming into the Earth hasn't changed much in the last century or so. It's actually got a little bit less in the last 50 or 60 years. But the amount of greenhouse gas has gone up a lot, and we know that's from human activity. So we're putting a thicker blanket on the Earth. And that's causing temperatures to go up. This is a graphic of global average temperatures over the last 140 years. 2019 is the last bar on that graph, and it's relative to the closest we can get to the pre-industrial temperature before 1900. And relative to that, the last 5 years, including 2019, have all been more than a degree above the pre-industrial value, about 1.1 on average. So we're running a little bit more than a degree above the pre-industrial. The Paris Agreement and now the Zero Carbon Act that New Zealand has talks about stopping at 1.5 degrees and certainly no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial. So we're well on the way to that. So there's a real sense of urgency here. But we don't we don't feel these gradual increases in temperature over the years. We feel extreme events. We feel heat waves. This is fairly obviously a picture from Paris, the Eiffel Tower in the background there, the big heat waves in Europe last summer in the Northern Hemisphere. Temperatures off the scale. Drought, this is a photograph taken in Northland just in the last few weeks. So very dry conditions are increasing in a lot of places, especially where it tends to be dry already, but a warmer climate means evaporation works more quickly, soils dry out faster, and you can get into drought conditions more quickly. But perversely, at the same time, the amount of moisture in the air is related to temperature. Warmer air can contain more moisture. So when you have a storm, it's more likely that you'll get a heavier rainfall event and you'll get more flooding, and we heard a bit about the flooding risk in the panel discussion just now. So for rainfall, the chances of getting more droughts is going up in a lot of places, but also the chances of getting heavy rainfall events is going up, which is a really strange facet of the whole problem. But yeah, we're getting more extremes at both ends of the rainfall scale. And then one that's really of concern for Kapiti, of course, is sea level rise. And I'll talk a little bit more about that for Kapiti in a minute or two. This is a graphic of global change in sea level over the last 140 years, again going back to 1880, where the 0 point is drawn on that vertical scale, and the scale is in millimetres, so global mean sea level, GMSL, change in millimetres. And that's getting on for 25 centimetres, 250 millimetres since 1880. The New Zealand rate averaged around the coast is similar to the global. We've had about 20 centimetres of sea level rise around the coast in the last 100 years or so. But this is not a straight line, it's a curve. The rate of rise back in the first part of the record is about 1 millimetre every year. The red part, the last 25 years where we've had satellite records as well as tide gauges, the rate of rise is about 3.5 millimetres per year. So we've roughly tripled the rate of sea level rise in the last century, and that's set to continue to rise over time. The main reason for that is these things, the big ice sheets, Greenland and Antarctica, are both melting, they're both losing ice, and they're losing ice at a more rapid rate as time goes on. So what we have here is, again, time along the bottom from 2002, so this is just the last 17 years, and the change in the amount of ice on these two big ice sheets in the vertical there. And the units here are gigatons, that's billions of tonnes of ice. So 1,000 gigatons is 1 trillion tonnes of ice. So we're talking about Greenland having lost nearly 5 trillion tonnes of ice in the last 17 years, and Antarctica having lost about 2.5 trillion tonnes of ice in the same time. So between them, something like 7 trillion tonnes of ice that's been lost off the big ice sheets in the last, or since 2002. Now, when you work it out, the oceans are pretty large, so you've got to melt 360 billion tonnes of ice and spread it out over the global oceans to get a layer that's 1 millimetre thick. So 7 trillion tonnes, which is a staggering amount of ice, adds up to about 20 millimetres, about 2 centimetres of sea level rise. So not so much yet, but the trouble is Greenland has enough ice on it to raise global sea levels by about 5 metres. The West Antarctic, which is the smaller part of the Antarctic ice sheets, which is melting most quickly at the moment, has enough ice on it to raise global sea levels by about 3 or 4 metres. The East Antarctic has enough ice on it to raise global sea levels by somewhere between 50 and 60 metres. I guess the good news there is it will take a very long time to melt a big piece of ice like the East Antarctic. We're talking 10,000 years or something, so that's not so much of a worry right now. The real worry is that we can trigger unstoppable, irreversible melting of some of this ice, especially the West Antarctic. If we get to something like 2 degrees of warming globally, then we're likely to see big parts of the West Antarctic just starting to melt away in a way it's a runaway situation and we can't stop it once it starts, and some scientists are worried we're just about there already. So the potential for metres of sea level rise is there if we allow warming to go beyond 2 degrees, roughly speaking. So coming closer to home, a 2 degree warming wherever you are, and this works for Kapiti as much as anywhere else in the country, you get roughly a tripling of the number of hot days. For Ōtaki, we might be talking about 25 degrees C, let's say. If you add in a bit less rain in the places that tend to be drier, and this doesn't really apply to Kapiti, we're not expecting a decrease in rainfall here, more in the eastern regions. But for instance, the Wairarapa, you'd expect to see something like a tripling of the occurrence of droughts with a warmer atmosphere and a little bit less rain. And when you put those together, that means that the risk of forest fires goes up dramatically. Again, maybe not so much a problem for the Kapiti coast, but we're seeing something like a projection of a doubling or a tripling of the number of days or months of extreme fire danger in the places in New Zealand that tend to experience more in the way of forest fires. Then again, coming back to sea level rise, as sea levels rise, events like this become more frequent, or they become easier to achieve. This is not a photograph from the Kapiti coast. This is actually a bit of coastal South Canterbury from about 5 years ago. There was a storm that ate away at these low cliffs along the coast, and part of the road was washed away. Now these cliffs have been eroding for a long time. It wasn't too unexpected, but this is just to illustrate the idea that as the sea level rises, when you have a storm, it becomes easier and easier for the waves to come inland further, and whatever's in the way of those waves is going to get eaten away eventually. So we've had about 20 centimetres of sea level rise around New Zealand in the last century. We've pretty much guaranteed 30 centimetres more in the next 40 years, so much more quickly than we've seen in the last 100 years. And the amount we get by the end of the century or beyond really depends on how much warmer we let the climate get. If we go beyond 2 degrees, then we're in for metres of sea level rise over hundreds of years. If we do what the Zero Carbon Act says and stop the warming at 1.5 degrees, then we'll maybe get half a metre of sea level rise by the end of the century. If things keep warming more quickly, then by the end of the century we could be looking at something more like 1.5 metres, which would be pretty hard to deal with. Okay, for the Kapiti coast, I live in Raumati, not right at the beach, but not far away from it. And if you just walk along the beach there, you see a range of different levels of preparedness, you might say. Seawalls that are quite comprehensive looking, other places where there's just a bit of scrub or a few rocks. And so individual properties are going to be affected in different ways depending on their own situation and what the local beachfront's doing, whether there's actually sand is building up in some places. So some places the risk of damage from sea level rise is less than others, but you really need to look at each place individually. As sea levels rise, the high tide mark just comes inland, so we know that all of these properties are going to be affected eventually. As we heard before, it's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. So the latest projections from NIWA for the Ministry for the Environment of sea level change over the next 150 years are shown here, starting in the year 2000. The vertical scale there is sea level rise for New Zealand on average. If you take a very extreme high scenario with no action on climate change at all, which I'm hoping is pretty unlikely these days, you get that red line. So you're looking at nearly 2 metres of sea level rise by the middle of next century. The more optimistic scenario, the green line, which is where we really take really significant action, soon you still get something like 0.5 metre of sea level rise in the next 80 to 100 years. So 0.5 metre of sea level rise, that might move the high tide mark inland by 30 or 40 metres. So if a property is within that range of the present high tide line, there's going to be trouble, even at the most optimistic end of the scale. So you look at the rate of change of extreme events at the coast, the 1 in 100 year coastal inundation event, and this is from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's report a few years ago, looking at Wellington Harbour, which is the closest I could get to Kapiti. So no sea level rise, 0 centimetres, you get a 1 in 100 year event every 100 years. By the time you've had 0.5 metre of sea level rise, you're getting that kind of event every couple of weeks. It's really amazing how quickly these frequencies and risks change. Again, it's just because the beach is quite flat. You raise the sea level a bit, the high tide line comes in a very long way. So we could be in a lot of trouble fairly quickly. Okay, so what does it mean for the Kapiti coast? Well, it means that anything that's very near the coast is in the firing line. So that's private properties, houses, it's roads, it's utilities, stormwater drains, power lines, train lines, anything that's right by the coast, and all these things are somewhere along the coast. Just to reiterate, every 10 centimetres of sea level rise, this is what the coastal engineers use as their rule, triples the occurrence of a given coastal inundation event. So 10 centimetres of sea level rise, the 1 in 100 year event becomes the 1 in 33 year event. 20 centimetres of sea level rise, it's 3 times 3, that's 9, and so on. So things change quickly. With increasing high temperature extremes, heat waves basically, then I know sometimes in the summer the trains running between Wellington and Kapiti have to go slow because the tracks start to warp a little bit. That will only become more of an issue as things get warmer. Also, roads can start to melt. It's the sort of thing you see featured in really hot parts of the world, but it can happen here. It has happened here once or twice in the last few years. And the whole agricultural sector, or horticultural sector in Kapiti, which is really important, I think, we need to be thinking quite hard about what that will look like in the future with a higher temperature and perhaps more variable rainfall kind of regime. Increased frequency of flooding, so when there's a storm you do tend to get heavier rainfall events, and I know the Wellington City Council are saying that, yeah, they're seeing a big increase in big spikes in rainfall, so the stormwater drain system in Wellington is really under a lot of pressure. And not only is there, bigger floods, but ponding is more of an issue. As the sea level rises, the water table rises, so it's harder and harder for water to drain away. When you have a flood, when you have a big rainfall event, the water sticks around for longer. So the sorts of things we can do to respond, which is what today's really all about, ultimately the coast is coming inland, so we have to move with that. So retreating from the coast, which is an easy thing to say, but it's a pretty hard thing to do, is something we need to be thinking pretty seriously about now. Improving drainage so that when there's a storm or some kind of king tide event, water can drain away better than it does at the moment. And changes to land use. This is more about horticulture and agriculture. We need to think about what will the climate be like in 20, 30, 50 years, and what should we be growing, how should we be using our land. Okay, I feel like I've gone on a bit here, but how we tackle this, we have to decarbonise the economy in New Zealand, we have to decarbonise the economy around the world, which again is something easy to say but rather hard to do. And do it in the next 30 years if we want to stop at 1.5 degrees of warming. So we get to 100% renewable electricity production, and then we get to 100% renewable energy production. That is all the energy we use for transport, for industry, not just electricity for powering our stoves and so on. We have to find ways to renewably produce all the energy we use. Changing land use, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report from last year on land use and climate change did suggest that a more plant-based approach to agriculture would be good news in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Just being more efficient with stuff, not having that mindset that we can just dig things up, use them, throw the waste away. Waste less, use energy more efficiently, have a much more recyclable, reusable kind of approach to all of the things that we have in our lives. And really, if you're thinking about sustainability long term, we're talking really about stopping growth of all sorts, because growth eventually is incompatible with sustainability on a finite planet. You just can't have more and more and more stuff. You can't have actually more and more and more people. You can't have more and more dollars in the economy. So the growth of what's called donut economics, or the circular economy, is a really heartening development in economics. This idea that instead of just having economic growth all the time, we actually get to a certain size of the global economy and keep it there, and we just recycle things. Because ultimately this is what we have to do if we're going to manage well as a species into the future. And this kind of thing is really what all of us as individuals can do. It's really interesting to hear on the panel this morning talking about that talking to your elected representatives, to government, about your concerns is really important, and just talking to each other is really important. It's pretty well known that the most resilient communities tend to be the most connected communities. We talk to each other, so I think this kind of gathering today is really important as part of getting our heads around what we have to do. Okay, so the climate is changing actually pretty dramatically. You look out the door today, it's a little bit hard to tell, but when you look on the longer term and on the bigger picture scale, it's really obvious things are changing dramatically. And that means sea level rise, it means rising temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, coastal inundation, you name it. Everything to do with the way we live our lives is changing. So we need to adapt to this. We need to plan, we need to be doing stuff right now, and we need to be thinking about the future. And improving community resilience, I think, through communication, through these kinds of community gatherings, and just helping each other, collaborate, cooperate, supporting each other is really what we need to be doing as much as anything. Just to finish off, just to say the future of the climate is really down to us. We are causing this problem. We are putting greenhouse gas in the air. Whenever we want to stop, that's when climate change is going to stop. And it's really just a question of how much damage are we prepared to commit to. Damage in terms of economic damage, human damage, infrastructure damage. The more extreme the extremes become, the harder it is to deal with. So it's really over to us to decide when we're going to stop doing this. And that's my lot. Thanks very much.